God told me to follow my heart, Miriam whispered, her voice carrying that peculiar mix of reverence and defiance I'd grown to recognize over our 12 years of marriage. She stood in our bedroom doorway, suitcase in hand, wearing that flowered dress she saved for special occasions. I figured this qualified as special, though not in any way I'd anticipated when I rolled out of bed that Tuesday morning. My name is Owen Tate, and I'm what you might call a practical man. I wire houses for a living, run my own electrical contracting business here in Millbrook, Tennessee. I believe in things you can see, touch, and measure with a voltmeter. When someone tells me God spoke to them directly, I tend to check if they've been sampling the communion wine a little too liberally. Your heart's telling you to pack a suitcase? I asked, setting down my coffee mug with more care than necessary. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward, while I wasn't paying attention. I'm moving to the sanctuary, she said, using that breathless tone she reserved for discussing Pastor Victor Kress and his magnificent church commune. The Lord has shown me a path to deeper spiritual fulfillment. The sanctuary, that's what they called the sprawling complex on the east side of town where Millbrook Community Church had built their empire. Started as a regular church building, but Pastor Kress had grand visions. Now it included dormitories, a cafeteria, meeting halls, and private apartments for the truly devoted. Members could live there full-time, surrendering their worldly possessions for the privilege of round-the-clock worship and fellowship. I'd always thought it looked more like a corporate retreat center than a house of worship, all glass and steel and carefully manicured lawns. But what did I know? I was just the guy who installed their electrical systems and occasionally wondered why a church needed quite so many dimmer switches. Miriam, we've been married 12 years. Don't you think this is something we should discuss? She adjusted her grip on the suitcase handle, and I noticed her wedding ring catching the morning light. Still wearing it, which I supposed counted for something. I've been praying about this for months, Owen. The Lord has been preparing my heart for this transition. Months. She'd been planning this for months, and I'd been completely oblivious. I thought back over recent weeks, trying to identify the signs I'd missed. The late-night prayer meetings that seemed to run longer each time. The way she'd started tithing larger amounts without discussing it with me first. The new clothes she'd bought, modest but expensive, claiming they were more appropriate for her increased responsibilities at church. What about us? What about our marriage? Marriage is a worldly institution, Owen. At the sanctuary, we're all married to Christ. I felt something twist in my chest, a combination of hurt and anger that I couldn't quite separate. That's a convenient way to put it. Her eyes flashed, and for a moment I saw the old Miriam, the one who used to argue politics with me over dinner and laugh at my terrible jokes about electrical puns. You've never understood my spiritual needs, she said. Pastor Kress says that sometimes God calls us to make difficult choices for our spiritual growth. Pastor Kress. Of course. Victor Kress, with his silver hair and $1,000 suits, his smooth voice that could make a grocery list sound like divine revelation. The man who'd transformed Millbrook Community Church from a modest congregation of 200 into a megachurch empire with over 1,500 members and a budget that rivaled some small corporations. I'd met him several times, naturally, given that my company had done most of the electrical work for the sanctuary's expansion. He was the kind of man who remembered your name and asked about your family, who could quote scripture with the same ease most people discussed the weather, the kind of man who made other men feel slightly inadequate without ever saying anything directly insulting. How long? I asked. How long what? How long have you been planning to abandon our marriage for Pastor Kress's spiritual guidance? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and I saw her flinch. It's not abandonment, Owen, it's growth. The sanctuary offers a level of spiritual community that I can't find anywhere else. Including here, with me. You don't even go to church anymore. She was right about that. I'd stopped attending Millbrook Community Church about 6 months ago, claiming work obligations but really just growing tired of the constant requests for donations, the pressure to commit to various volunteer activities, and the way every sermon seemed to circle back to the importance of financial sacrifice for the Lord's work. "I go sometimes," I said weakly. "Easter and Christmas don't count." I watched her adjust the suitcase again and realized this conversation wasn't going to change anything. She'd already made her decision. This wasn't a discussion. It was a notification. "What about the house, the bills, our bank accounts?" "I've already transferred my portion of our savings to the church. The sanctuary provides for all my needs now." "You did what?" "It's my money too, Owen. I have every right to donate it to the Lord's work." I felt the room spin slightly. Our savings account, the one we'd been building for years, planning for retirement, maybe a vacation to Europe someday. Half of it, gone, donated to Pastor Cress's empire without so much as a conversation. "How much?" $18,000. 18,000. Nearly half our entire savings handed over to a church that already owned millions in property and assets. "Miriam, that was our emergency fund, our future." "My future is with the Lord now, Owen. I'm sorry you can't understand that." She turned to leave, and I found myself following her to the front door, still wearing my pajama pants and feeling ridiculous. "This is insane," I said. "You can't just walk away from everything we've built together." "I'm not walking away. I'm walking towards something better." She paused at the door, and for a moment I thought she might reconsider. Instead, she reached up and kissed my cheek, the kind of kiss you give a distant relative at a funeral. "I'll pray for you, Owen. I hope someday you'll understand." And then she was gone, walking down our driveway toward a white van with Millbrook Community Church painted on the side in cheerful blue letters. I recognized the driver as Bethany Morrison, Miriam's closest friend at church, a woman who'd always struck me as the type who collected gossip like some people collected stamps. I stood in my doorway, watching my wife of 12 years climb into that van and disappear around the corner, heading toward her new life of spiritual fulfillment and communal living. The house felt different immediately, emptier in a way that went beyond just one person's absence. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down at our small table, staring at the coffee mug I'd abandoned. The coffee had gone cold, and I found myself wondering if that was some kind of metaphor. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a crazy moment, I thought it might be Miriam, already having second thoughts. Instead, it was Jake Morrison, Bethany's husband, asking if I could look at some wiring problems at his auto shop later that week. Life, apparently, was going to continue whether I was ready for it or not. I spent the rest of the morning walking through our house, taking inventory of what Miriam had taken and what she'd left behind. Most of her clothes were gone, along with her jewelry, photo albums, and the collection of religious books that had taken over 2 full shelves in our bedroom. She'd left her wedding dress hanging in the back of the closet, which seemed either symbolic or cruel, depending on how you looked at it. In the bathroom, her toothbrush was gone, but she'd left behind the expensive face cream I'd bought her for Christmas. In the kitchen, she'd taken her favorite coffee mug, but left the matching set we'd received as a wedding gift. It was like she'd tried to erase herself from our shared life while leaving just enough traces behind to remind me of what I'd lost. By afternoon, I was angry. Not just hurt or confused, but genuinely angry in a way I hadn't felt since high school, when Tommy Richardson had cheated me out of $20 in a poker game and then bragged about it to half the senior class. I called my brother Eli, who lived about an hour away in Nashville and worked construction when he could find it. "She did what?" Eli's voice carried clearly through the phone, along with the sound of hammering in the background. "Moved to the church commune. Took $18,000 with her." Jesus Christ, Owen, that's half your savings. "Don't take the Lord's name in vain," I said automatically, then realized how ridiculous that sounded given the circumstances. "You sound like you're handling this well." "I'm handling it terribly." I keep expecting her to walk back through the door and tell me it was all some kind of test of my faith. Maybe it is. A test of what? My ability to get screwed over by my own wife? Eli was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him putting down whatever tool he'd been using. You want me to come down there? No. Maybe. I don't know what I want. You want to get even. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized he was right. I did want to get even. I wanted Miriam to understand what she'd thrown away, wanted Pastor Cress to face some consequences for breaking up a marriage, wanted the whole sanctuary community to see the reality behind their spiritual paradise. Yeah, I said. I think I do. Well, that's a start. Getting mad is better than getting depressed. After I hung up with Eli, I sat in my living room and tried to make sense of what had happened. 12 years of marriage ended with a suitcase and a Bible verse. $18,000, donated to a church that probably spent more than that on landscaping each month. But the more I thought about it, the more questions started forming in my mind. Questions about Pastor Cress and his special interest in helping married women find their spiritual paths. Questions about the sanctuary's finances and where all that donated money actually went. Questions about what kind of spiritual guidance required my wife to abandon her marriage and move into a commune. I'd always been good at solving problems. It's what made me successful as an electrician. You follow the wires, test the connections, identify where the power is flowing and where it's getting interrupted. Then you fix what's broken. Maybe it was time to do some detective work on the sanctuary's wiring, so to speak. That evening, I drove past the church complex, something I'd done hundreds of times before, but never with this kind of attention. The main building was lit up like a casino, with cars filling the parking lot for what I assumed was their Tuesday night Bible study. The residential buildings behind it glowed with warm light from dozens of windows, creating the impression of a small, self-contained town. Somewhere in there, Miriam was probably settling into her new room, unpacking her suitcase, preparing for a life of communal worship and spiritual fulfillment. Maybe she was already regretting her decision. Maybe she was happier than she'd been in years. Either way, I was going to find out exactly what kind of sanctuary she'd chosen over our marriage. Wednesday morning brought the first real taste of what my new reality would look like. I woke up in an empty house, made coffee for one, and ate breakfast at a kitchen table that suddenly seemed too big. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. I'd always been an early riser, but Miriam had been the one who brought life to our mornings. She'd hum while making breakfast, comment on news stories from her phone, plan out loud about her day's activities. Without her chatter, the house felt more like a museum than a home. My first stop was the bank, where I confirmed what I already knew but hoped wasn't true. Our joint savings account, which had contained $34,000 on Monday, now held $16,000 and change. Miriam had cleaned out her half right down to the penny, which suggested this hadn't been an impulsive decision driven by sudden spiritual revelation. The withdrawal was made yesterday morning, the teller explained, a young woman who looked barely old enough to handle other people's money. A cashier's check made out to Millbrook Community Church. And you didn't think to call me? It's a joint account. She had every legal right to withdraw her portion, sir. Bank policy doesn't require spousal notification for joint account holders. Legal right. There was that phrase again. The same one Miriam had used to justify her donation. Technically correct, morally questionable, and personally devastating. From the bank, I drove to my office, a converted garage behind my house where I kept my tools, equipment, and business records. I had 3 jobs scheduled for the rest of the week, including the wiring inspection at Jake Morrison's auto shop. Normal work, normal problems, normal solutions. The kind of thing I could handle without my world falling apart. But first, I wanted to do some research. I'd kept detailed records of every job my company had done for Millbrook Community Church over the past 5 years. What had started as occasional repair work had grown into a steady stream of projects as the sanctuary expanded. New dormitory buildings, upgraded kitchen facilities, a state-of-the-art sound system for the main sanctuary, and dozens of smaller electrical jobs. Looking through the invoices, I was surprised by the total amount. Over $200,000 in electrical work, all paid promptly and without complaint. The church had money, serious money, and they weren't shy about spending it. But what caught my attention were the dates. The major expansion projects had all started about 3 years ago, right around the time Pastor Kress had launched his Living Faith initiative, encouraging members to move into the sanctuary complex for deeper spiritual community. I pulled out my phone and started researching the church's public financial records. As a religious organization, they weren't required to disclose much, but they did file basic information with the state. What I found was impressive and slightly disturbing. Millbrook Community Church had assets worth over $12 million. Their annual income from donations and tithes exceeded $3 million. Pastor Kress himself drew a salary of $250,000 per year, plus housing allowances, travel expenses, and other benefits that probably doubled his actual compensation. Not bad for a man of God in a town where the median household income was $42,000. I was still digging through financial records when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Owen Tate Electrical. Mr. Tate, this is Lenore Kress. I nearly dropped the phone. Lenore Kress, Pastor Victor's wife, calling me directly. In 12 years of doing work for their church, I'd maybe exchanged 50 words with the woman. Mrs. Kress, how can I help you? I was wondering if we could meet for coffee. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you. Her voice was calm, controlled, with just a hint of something I couldn't identify. Nervousness? Anger? It was hard to tell over the phone. What kind of things? The kind that are better discussed in person. Are you free this afternoon? I glanced at my schedule. I had a service call at 2, but nothing that couldn't be rescheduled. I could meet you at 3. Where did you have in mind? Do you know Riverside Cafe? It's downtown near the courthouse. I knew it. A quiet place. The kind where you could have a private conversation without being overheard. Not the sort of establishment where the pastor's wife would normally be seen with a recently abandoned husband. I'll be there at 3. Thank you, Owen. And please, don't mention this to anyone. The line went quiet, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering what Lenore Kress could possibly want to discuss with me. In all my interactions with the church leadership, she'd been a background figure, elegant and composed, but rarely speaking unless directly addressed. The perfect pastor's wife, supportive but not overshadowing her husband's authority. But there had been something in her voice, a tension that suggested she wasn't as content with her role as she appeared in public. I spent the next few hours trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting to the upcoming meeting. What could the pastor's wife want with me? Was this some kind of intervention, an attempt to counsel me through my marital crisis, or was there something else going on? At 2:30, I drove downtown and parked near the courthouse. Riverside Cafe occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house, with small tables scattered across what had once been a living room and dining room. It was the kind of place that attracted lawyers, real estate agents, and other professionals who needed to conduct business over coffee and sandwiches. Lenore was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with her back to the wall. She looked different than she did on Sunday mornings, less formal somehow. Instead of her usual elegant dresses and carefully styled hair, she wore jeans and a simple blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I have to admit, I'm curious about what this is about." A waitress appeared and I ordered coffee while Lenore requested tea. We sat in silence until our drinks arrived, both of us apparently trying to figure out how to begin this conversation. "I heard about Miriam," she said finally. News travels fast. In a church community, it travels at the speed of light, especially when it involves someone moving into the sanctuary. There was something in her tone, a slight edge that suggested she wasn't entirely supportive of the sanctuary's residential program. "I suppose you're here to counsel me about accepting God's plan for my marriage," she laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "God's plan. Is that what we're calling it now?" I studied her face, trying to read the expression behind her carefully controlled features. Lenore Cress was an attractive woman in her early 40s, with the kind of understated elegance that came from good breeding and careful attention to appearance. But there was something else there now, something that looked almost like anger. "What are we calling it, then?" She glanced around the cafe, confirming that no one was within earshot, then leaned forward slightly. "We're calling it the latest example of my husband's special ministry to lonely wives." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected something, of course, but hearing it stated so directly by the pastor's own wife was different than my private speculation. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that Victor has a pattern, a very specific pattern of identifying women in troubled marriages and offering them spiritual guidance that somehow always leads to them moving into the sanctuary, where he has unlimited access to provide private counseling sessions." She took a sip of her tea, her hands perfectly steady despite what she was telling me. "How many?" "Miriam makes 7. In the past 3 years. 7 women. 7 marriages broken up by Pastor Cress's special brand of spiritual guidance." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "And you know this how?" "Because I'm not blind, Owen, and because I've been keeping track." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind you might use for grocery lists or phone numbers. She opened it to a page covered with neat handwriting. Jennifer Walsh left her husband 2 years ago, moved to the sanctuary for spiritual growth, donated $22,000 to the church. Sandra Mitchell, same story 15 months ago, donated $31,000. Patricia Hendricks, 8 months ago, donated $19,000. She continued reading names and amounts, a catalog of broken marriages and transferred wealth that painted a picture I didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired of watching my husband destroy families for his own gratification, and because you're the first husband who might actually be able to do something about it." "What makes you think that?" "Because you're not a member of the church. You don't have any spiritual loyalty to Victor that might complicate your judgment, and because you have access to information that could be very useful." "What kind of information?" "Financial records, building plans, security systems. You've worked on every major project at the sanctuary for the past 5 years. You know that complex better than almost anyone." I stared at her, beginning to understand what she was suggesting. "You want me to help you expose your own husband?" "I want to stop him before he destroys any more families. The question is whether you want to get your wife back or just sit here feeling sorry for yourself." Her words stung, partly because they were true. I had been feeling sorry for myself, wallowing in hurt and confusion instead of taking action. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet, but I think between your technical knowledge and my inside information, we might be able to find a way to show the congregation who Victor really is. That's a dangerous game. He's your husband. He stopped being my husband the first time he decided that God was calling him to provide special comfort to another man's wife." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable now, and I realized that Lenore Cress had been living with this knowledge for years, watching her husband seduce other women under the guise of spiritual ministry while maintaining the facade of a perfect pastoral marriage. "Why haven't you left him?" "Because leaving would mean abandoning the church, the community, everything I've built here, and it would mean letting him continue his pattern without anyone watching, without anyone keeping track." "So you've been gathering evidence?" "I've been documenting patterns, but I haven't been able to prove anything concrete. That's where you come in." I thought about Miriam, somewhere in the sanctuary complex, probably believing that she'd found a deeper spiritual connection with Pastor Cress. I thought about the other wives, the broken marriages, the donated money that had funded the very buildings where these spiritual seductions took place. What do you need from me? Access, information, and someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. I'm an electrician, not a private investigator. You're a man who knows how to solve problems, and right now, Victor Cress is a problem that needs solving. We talked for another hour, outlining the beginning of a plan that seemed both necessary and incredibly risky. Lenore had years of observations and suspicions, but no concrete proof of her husband's activities. I had technical knowledge of the sanctuary's systems and no emotional investment in protecting the church's reputation. Together, we might be able to expose the truth behind Pastor Cress's ministry to lonely wives. As we prepared to leave, Lenore reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "I'm sorry about Miriam," she said. "I know this is painful for you. It's painful for both of us." "Yes, but you still have a chance to get your life back." "I'm not sure I do." I watched her walk to her car, a woman trapped in a marriage that had become a performance, playing the role of supportive pastor's wife, while her husband systematically destroyed other marriages for his own gratification. But she was wrong about one thing. We both had a chance to get our lives back. We just had to be smart enough and brave enough to take it. Thursday morning found me parked across the street from the sanctuary complex at 6:30, sipping coffee from a thermos and watching the early morning routine of communal living unfold. I'd positioned myself behind a cluster of oak trees that provided decent cover while still allowing a clear view of the main residential building. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad detective movie. But Lenore had been right about one thing. If we were going to expose Pastor Cress's pattern of behavior, we needed concrete evidence, not just suspicions and circumstantial observations. The first residents emerged around 7, heading toward the main building for what I assumed was communal breakfast. I recognized several faces from my years of occasional church attendance, but I was looking for one face in particular. Miriam appeared at 7:15, walking with Bethany Morrison and 2 other women I didn't recognize. She was wearing a simple blue dress that I'd never seen before, and her hair was pulled back in a style that seemed more conservative than her usual look. Even from a distance, she appeared different somehow, more subdued. I watched her disappear into the main building and felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at her abandonment of our marriage, hurt at being replaced by communal living and spiritual guidance, and, if I was honest with myself, genuine concern for what she might be getting herself into. My phone buzzed with a text from Lenore. "Meeting tonight, 8 p.m., my place. Victor has board meeting until 10. I typed back, "Your house? Isn't that risky?" "Safest place. He never comes home early from board meetings." The rest of the day passed slowly. I had 2 service calls scheduled, routine maintenance work that normally would have occupied my full attention, but now felt like busy work while I waited for evening to arrive. At 7:30, I drove to the Cress house, a large colonial-style home about 2 miles from the church complex. It was the kind of house that projected success and stability, with perfectly maintained landscaping and a circular driveway that could accommodate multiple cars. Lenore answered the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. "Come in quickly," she said, leading me through a formal living room toward what appeared to be a home office. The house was exactly what I'd expected from a successful pastor's home: expensive furniture arranged with professional precision, religious artwork on the walls, and an overall atmosphere of prosperity and good taste. But it felt cold somehow, more like a showroom than a place where people actually lived. "Victor's study," Lenore explained, gesturing toward a leather chair across from a massive oak desk. "He won't be back for at least 2 hours. She'd changed clothes since our meeting yesterday, now wearing dark jeans and a black sweater that made her look more like a cat burglar than a pastor's wife. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I began. "About Victor's pattern?" About all of it. The broken marriages, the donated money, the way the sanctuary operates. I think you're right about there being something systematic going on here. She nodded, settling into the chair behind the desk. I've been documenting Victor's behavior for almost 2 years now. Would you like to see what I've found? She opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, spreading its contents across the desk surface. What I saw was impressive and disturbing in equal measure. Photographs of Victor with various women, taken at different times and locations around the church complex. Financial records showing large donations from families that had subsequently broken up. Copies of emails and text messages that, while not explicitly inappropriate, showed a level of personal attention that went well beyond normal pastoral care. How did you get all this? I'm his wife. I have access to his computer, his phone, his calendar, and I've been paying attention. I picked up one of the photographs, a shot of Victor and a woman I recognized as Sandra Mitchell, walking very close together near the sanctuary's garden area. Their body language suggested intimacy that went beyond spiritual counseling. This is Sandra? 2 weeks before she left her husband. Victor had been providing her with marriage counseling for about 3 months at that point. Where's Sandra now? Gone. She moved away about 6 months after her divorce was finalized, but not before donating her entire settlement to the church. I studied the other photographs, seeing the same pattern repeated with different women. Close physical proximity, intimate conversation, private meetings in locations away from the main church areas. What about Miriam? Do you have anything current? Lenore's expression darkened. Not yet. But Victor's already started his usual routine. Private prayer sessions, special spiritual guidance meetings, extended counseling about her marital difficulties. How do you know about the private meetings? Because I've learned to track his schedule, and because the sanctuary's security system keeps logs of keycard access to different areas of the complex. This caught my attention. Security logs? How detailed are they? Very detailed. Timestamps, location access, duration of visits. Victor had the system installed 2 years ago, supposedly for resident safety, but it also creates a perfect record of his movements. And you have access to these logs? I have access to Victor's computer, and he never logs out of the security system interface. I felt a spark of excitement. Security logs were exactly the kind of concrete evidence we'd need to establish a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Time-stamped proof of private meetings, late-night visits, extended counseling sessions that happened away from public areas. Can you show me how to access the system? Better than that. I can give you remote access. Victor set up the system so he could monitor it from home. All you need is the login information. She turned to the computer on the desk and pulled up what appeared to be a web-based interface for the sanctuary's security system. Multiple camera feeds showed different areas of the complex, and a sidebar displayed recent access logs for various buildings and rooms. This is incredible, I said, watching the real-time feeds. He can monitor the entire complex from here? From here, from his office, from his phone. Victor likes to keep track of his flock. The irony wasn't lost on me. Pastor Kress had installed a comprehensive surveillance system to monitor his congregation, but that same system could now be used to monitor him. What about the cameras? Can we access recorded footage? The system keeps recordings for 30 days. After that, they're automatically deleted unless specifically saved. So if we can identify suspicious activity in the logs, we can pull the corresponding video footage? Exactly. But we need to move quickly. If Victor realizes someone else has been accessing the system, he'll change all the passwords. We spent the next hour going through the security logs, identifying patterns in Pastor Kress's movements around the complex. What we found was disturbing, but not surprising. Victor had keycard access to every area of the sanctuary, including the residential buildings where members lived. The logs showed him making frequent visits to the women's dormitory, often late at night or early in the morning. Many of these visits lasted several hours. More specifically, the logs showed him accessing Miriam's residential building every night since she'd moved in, usually between 10 and 11 p.m., with visits lasting anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. Spiritual counseling sessions? I asked. That's what he'd call them if anyone asked. I stared at the computer screen, feeling a mixture of anger and vindication. Here was concrete evidence of Victor's inappropriate behavior, time-stamped and documented by his own security system. Can we access the camera footage from these visits? Lenore clicked through several screens, pulling up recorded video from the residential building cameras. The footage was surprisingly clear, showing Victor entering the building, walking down hallways, and stopping at specific doors. There, she said, pointing at the screen. That's Miriam's room. I watched my wife open her door to admit Pastor Kress, both of them disappearing inside. The timestamp showed 11:15 p.m. just 2 nights ago. How long was he in there? Lenore checked the access logs. 2 hours and 43 minutes. 2 hours and 43 minutes of private spiritual counseling in my wife's bedroom. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. We need to save all of this, I said. I've been saving everything. But Owen, we need to be careful about how we use this information. If we move too quickly or too obviously, Victor will find a way to discredit us. What do you suggest? We need more evidence, and we need to find a way to present it that can't be dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled ex-husband and a jealous wife. She was right, of course. What we had was compelling, but it could easily be explained away as misinterpretation or vindictive manipulation. We needed something more definitive, more public, more impossible to ignore. What about the other women? The ones who've already left their husbands? Most of them have moved away, but I might be able to contact a few of them, see if they'd be willing to share their experiences. And the financial records? The donations? Those are harder to access. The church's financial information is closely guarded, and Victor handles most of it personally. I thought about this for a moment, then remembered something from my own business records. What about building permits? Construction contracts? If the church has been expanding as quickly as it seems, there should be public records of major expenditures. That's brilliant. And those records would be public, available through the county offices. We talked for another 30 minutes, outlining a more comprehensive investigation plan. Lenore would continue monitoring Victor's activities through the security system while trying to contact former congregation members. I would research the church's financial dealings through public records and building permits. As I prepared to leave, Lenore walked me to the front door. Owen, I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. Victor is still my husband, despite everything. I understand. But he's destroying people's lives. Yes, he is, and it has to stop. I drove home through empty streets, my mind racing with everything I'd learned. The security footage, the access logs, the pattern of behavior that painted Pastor Kress as a predator who used his position to manipulate vulnerable women. But I also thought about Miriam, alone in her room at the sanctuary, believing that she was receiving genuine spiritual guidance from a man of God. She had no idea that she was just the latest target in a systematic pattern of seduction and manipulation. The question now was whether we could expose the truth before Victor completed his conquest of my wife and moved on to his next victim. Back home, I sat in my empty living room and stared at the ceiling, planning our next moves. We had evidence, but we needed more. We had suspicions, but we needed proof. And we had a narrow window of time before Victor realized he was being watched. It was going to be a long night, and an even longer few weeks ahead. Friday morning brought an unexpected development. I was reviewing county building permits at the courthouse when my phone rang with a call from Jake Morrison. Owen, I need to cancel that electrical work at my shop. Problem with the scheduling? Problem with my wife. Bethany says we shouldn't be doing business with you right now, given your spiritual situation. I almost laughed at the phrase, my spiritual situation. As if losing my wife to a church commune was some kind of contagious condition that might spread through business relationships. Jake, we've known each other for 15 years. I know, and I'm sorry about this. But Bethany's pretty involved with the church leadership, and she thinks it would be inappropriate for us to maintain our business relationship while you're going through this marital crisis. Inappropriate how? She says Pastor Kress feels that supporting you financially might enable your resistance to God's plan for your marriage. There it was again. God's plan. The convenient excuse for every decision that benefited Pastor Kress and his expanding influence over the congregation. After hanging up with Jake, I called 2 other clients who had jobs scheduled for the following week. Both canceled, citing similar concerns about my spiritual situation and the need to support the church's guidance in marital matters. In the space of one morning, I'd lost nearly $4,000 in scheduled work. It seemed that Pastor Kress's influence extended beyond just stealing wives. He was also capable of destroying livelihoods. I was still processing this economic pressure when Lenore called. We need to meet. I found something important. More security footage? Better. Financial records. Can you meet me at the same place as yesterday? Your house, in daylight? Victor's at a regional pastors' conference until Sunday. I'm alone. An hour later, I was back in Pastor Kress's study, looking at spreadsheets and bank statements that Lenore had somehow accessed from her husband's computer. How did you get these? Victor keeps everything on his computer. Church finances, personal accounts, investment records. He's not very careful about security when he's at home. The documents she'd printed painted a picture of financial manipulation that went far beyond what I'd imagined. The church's books showed massive donations from individuals, but the money didn't stay in the general fund. Instead, it was transferred to various accounts controlled directly by Pastor Kress. Look at this, Lenore said, pointing to a particular transaction. Sandra Mitchell's donation of $31,000. It went into the general fund on Monday, then was transferred to Victor's personal investment account on Wednesday. That's embezzlement. That's Victor's retirement plan. He's been systematically transferring donated funds to personal accounts for over 2 years. I studied the records more carefully, tracing the flow of money from donations to church accounts to personal investments. The amounts were staggering. Over the past 2 years, Pastor Kress had diverted nearly $400,000 in donated funds to his personal use. This is criminal fraud. Yes, it is. But proving it would require access to records that Victor keeps very carefully protected. These printouts wouldn't be admissible in court because I obtained them without authorization. But they show us where to look for legitimate evidence. Exactly. And they give us leverage. I was beginning to understand Lenore's strategy. We didn't need to build a criminal case against her husband. We just needed to expose his behavior in a way that would destroy his credibility with the congregation and force him to stop his predatory pattern. What about the security footage? Any new developments there? Lenore's expression darkened. Victor visited Miriam again last night. 3 hours this time. 3 hours of private spiritual counseling. I felt my anger building again, but I forced myself to focus on the evidence rather than the emotions. Are you still recording these visits? Everyone. But Owen, there's something else you need to see. She turned to the computer and pulled up the security system interface, navigating to a camera feed I hadn't seen before. This is Victor's private office in the main church building. Watch what happened yesterday afternoon. The footage showed Pastor Kress meeting with a woman I didn't recognize, someone in her 30s with short blonde hair and an expensive-looking business suit. Who is she? Rebecca Martinez. She's married to Tom Martinez, who owns the largest construction company in the county. They've been attending the church for about 6 months. I watched Victor and Rebecca talking intently, their body language suggesting the same kind of intimate conversation I'd seen in the photographs of his previous targets. He's starting the process with someone new. While he's still working on Miriam, Victor's getting more aggressive, more confident. I think he believes he's untouchable. The arrogance was breathtaking. Pastor Kress was simultaneously seducing my wife while beginning the same process with another married woman, all while embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own congregation. We need to move faster, I said. Agreed. But we also need to be smarter. Victor has too much power in this community to be brought down by accusations alone. What do you suggest? Public exposure. Something so obvious and undeniable that even his most loyal supporters can't ignore it. We spent the next 2 hours planning what Lenore called the revelation, a coordinated exposure of Pastor Kress's financial crimes and inappropriate conduct, timed for maximum impact and minimal opportunity for damage control. The plan was ambitious and risky. We would need to coordinate multiple elements simultaneously: financial evidence, security footage, witness testimony, and public presentation. But if it worked, it would end Victor's reign over the sanctuary and free his current and future victims from his manipulation. As we worked through the details, I found myself impressed by Lenore's strategic thinking. She understood her husband's weaknesses, knew the congregation's dynamics, and had a clear vision of how to turn Victor's own systems against him. "Why didn't you do this earlier?" I asked. "You've had access to this information for months." "Because I needed someone else to share the risk, and because I needed someone who had nothing to lose." Nothing to lose? Your marriage is already broken, Owen. Your business relationships are being destroyed by Victor's influence. You have every reason to fight back and very little left to protect. She was right, of course. I'd already lost everything that mattered to me. That made me dangerous in a way that someone with more to lose couldn't be. "When do we do this?" "Sunday morning, during the main service. Maximum attendance, maximum impact." "What about Miriam? She'll be there." "Yes, she will, and she'll see exactly what kind of man she's chosen over her husband." The thought of publicly humiliating Miriam was both satisfying and painful. I wanted her to understand what she'd thrown away, but I also didn't want to destroy her completely. "She's a victim too," I said. "Yes, she is. But she's also an adult who made choices. Sometimes people need to face the consequences of those choices before they can make better ones." Lenore was harder than I'd initially realized, shaped by years of watching her husband manipulate and destroy other people's lives. But her hardness was exactly what we needed to succeed. We finished planning around 5 o'clock, with detailed assignments for both of us over the next 2 days. I would gather additional financial evidence from public records while Lenore continued monitoring Victor's activities and preparing the security footage for presentation. As I prepared to leave, Lenore handed me a flash drive. "Copies of everything we've discussed today. Keep it somewhere safe." "Where are you keeping your copies?" "Multiple locations. If something happens to me, there are people who will know where to find the evidence." The implication was sobering. We were planning to destroy a man with significant power and influence in the community. If Victor realized what we were doing before Sunday, he might take steps to protect himself that could be dangerous for both of us. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." I drove home with the flash drive in my pocket, feeling like I was carrying a bomb with a timer counting down to Sunday morning. Everything we'd planned depended on precision, timing, and Victor's continued ignorance of our investigation. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced since Miriam left. Hope. Hope that justice might actually be possible. Hope that the truth might actually matter. Hope that sometimes the good guys really could win. Sunday was still 2 days away, but I could already imagine the moment when Pastor Victor Kress would finally face the consequences of his actions. The moment when his victims would see him for what he really was. the moment when his empire of manipulation and fraud would finally collapse. It was going to be quite a revelation. Saturday night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined everything that could go wrong with our plan. Victor discovering our investigation early, the security footage being dismissed as misinterpretation, the congregation choosing to believe their charismatic pastor over the evidence we'd gathered. But by Sunday morning, my nervousness had transformed into cold determination. I'd spent 2 days gathering additional evidence from public records, documenting the flow of donated money from church accounts to Pastor Cress's personal investments. Combined with Lenore's security footage and financial records, we had a comprehensive case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. I arrived at Millbrook Community Church at 9:30, 30 minutes before the main service began. The parking lot was already crowded with cars, and I could see people streaming toward the main sanctuary building. I recognized many faces from my years of occasional attendance, including several clients who had recently canceled their contracts with my business. Lenore had texted me earlier with final instructions. Sanctuary balcony, northwest corner, equipment ready. I made my way into the church building, nodding politely to people I recognized but avoiding extended conversations. The sanctuary was filling up quickly, with nearly 800 people taking their seats for what they expected to be a normal Sunday worship service. From my position in the balcony, I had a clear view of the entire congregation. I spotted Miriam in the third row, sitting with Bethany Morrison and several other women from the Sanctuary residential program. She was wearing the same blue dress I'd seen her in earlier that week, and her hair was styled in the conservative manner that seemed to be standard for the church's female residents. Pastor Cress took the stage at exactly 10 o'clock, looking confident and commanding in his expensive navy suit. His opening remarks were typically smooth, welcoming the congregation and announcing the morning's theme, walking in faith through difficult times. The irony was perfect. I waited through the first hymn and the opening prayer, watching for Lenore's signal. She was seated in the front row with the other church leaders' wives, looking composed and attentive. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the perfect pastor's wife, supportively attending her husband's sermon. The signal came during the second hymn, when Lenore stood and walked toward the side exit, as if heading to the restroom. That was my cue to activate the equipment she'd hidden in the sanctuary's sound booth. Moving quickly but quietly, I made my way to the small room that controlled the church's audio-visual systems. Lenore had prepared everything in advance, connecting a laptop to the main projection system and loading the files we'd need for our presentation. Pastor Cress was beginning his sermon when I activated the first part of our plan. The large screens that normally displayed hymn lyrics and Bible verses suddenly showed a different kind of text. Financial records documenting the transfer of donated funds to Victor's personal accounts. The congregation's reaction was immediate and confused. People began pointing at the screens and murmuring to each other, trying to understand what they were seeing. Pastor Cress, initially unaware of the display behind him, continued his sermon about faith and trust. As we face challenges in our personal lives, he was saying, we must remember that God has a plan for each of us, even when that plan requires difficult sacrifices. The murmuring grew louder as more people noticed the financial records on the screens. Someone called out, "Pastor Cress, what are those numbers?" Victor turned to look at the screens for the first time, and I watched his confident expression transform into shock and then anger. He immediately gestured toward the sound booth, clearly expecting someone to fix the technical malfunction. Instead, I activated the second part of our presentation, security camera footage showing Victor's late-night visits to the women's residential building, time-stamped and clearly documented. The sanctuary erupted in confused conversation as 800 people watched their pastor entering the dormitory building at 11 p.m., walking down hallways and stopping at specific doors. The footage was clear enough to identify Victor's face and detailed enough to track his movements throughout the building. "Turn that off," Victor shouted into his microphone, his composure completely shattered. "This is some kind of technical error." But the footage continued, showing visit after visit, night after night, with timestamps that made it impossible to dismiss as coincidental or innocent. The congregation could see exactly how often their pastor was providing private counseling to female residents, and exactly how long those sessions lasted. Lenore chose that moment to stand up from her front row seat. "It's not a technical error, Victor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's sound system. "It's the truth." The sanctuary fell silent as the pastor's wife walked toward the stage, carrying a folder of documents. "For 2 years, I've watched my husband systematically target married women in this congregation," she continued, her voice steady and clear. "I've documented his pattern of seduction, his financial crimes, and his abuse of pastoral authority." Victor was staring at his wife in apparent disbelief, as if he couldn't process what was happening. "Lenore, you don't know what you're doing," he said into the microphone. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm exposing a predator who has used his position to destroy families and steal from his own congregation." The screens now showed a comprehensive summary of our investigation: financial records, security footage, timeline documentation, and a list of the 7 women who had left their husbands after receiving Victor's spiritual counseling. I could see Miriam in the crowd, her face pale with shock as she recognized her own name on the list of Victor's targets. Around her, other congregation members were reading the evidence, putting together the pieces of a pattern they'd never recognized before. "This is lies!" Victor shouted, abandoning any pretense of pastoral calm. "This is a conspiracy by my enemies to destroy God's work." But his protests were drowned out by the growing anger of the congregation. People were standing up, shouting questions, demanding explanations. Several men were moving toward the stage, and their expressions suggested they weren't coming to offer support. I activated the final part of our presentation, recorded phone calls between Victor and several of his victims, conversations that Lenore had captured using her husband's own phone system. The audio was clear and undeniable, showing Victor's manipulation tactics and his promises of spiritual fulfillment through physical intimacy. "You recorded my private conversations?" Victor screamed at his wife. "I recorded evidence of your crimes," Lenore replied calmly. The sanctuary was in complete chaos now, with people shouting, crying, and demanding answers. Several church elders had taken the stage, trying to restore order while simultaneously processing the evidence of their pastor's misconduct. I watched from the balcony as Victor's empire of manipulation collapsed in real time. The man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just minutes earlier was now facing the unified anger of 800 people he'd betrayed and deceived. But the most satisfying moment came when I saw Miriam stand up from her seat, her face a mixture of horror and understanding. She was looking at the screens, reading the evidence, finally seeing the truth about the man she'd chosen over her marriage. Victor made one last desperate attempt to control the situation, grabbing the microphone and shouting about forgiveness and God's mercy. But his words were lost in the crowd's anger, and several men were now climbing onto the stage to confront him directly. That's when I decided it was time to leave. Lenore and I had accomplished what we'd set out to do. Victor's crimes were exposed, his victims were free to see the truth, and his power over the congregation was permanently broken. I slipped out of the sound booth and made my way toward the parking lot, passing groups of church members who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Some were crying, some were angry, and some seemed relieved to finally understand what had been happening in their community. As I reached my truck, I saw Lenore emerging from the church building, surrounded by several women who appeared to be offering support and comfort. She looked exhausted but satisfied, like someone who had finally completed a long and difficult task. Our eyes met across the parking lot, and she nodded once before turning back to the people around her. We'd done what we set out to do. Victor Cress's reign of manipulation and abuse was over. I drove home through empty Sunday streets, listening to the radio and thinking about what came next. The church would need new leadership. The congregation would need time to heal. The legal system would need to investigate Victor's financial crimes. And somewhere in that chaos, Miriam would need to decide what kind of life she wanted to build after discovering that her spiritual awakening had been nothing more than an elaborate seduction. My phone was ringing as I pulled into my driveway, but I didn't answer it. Whatever conversations needed to happen, whatever consequences needed to be faced, they could wait until tomorrow. For now, it was enough to know that the truth had finally been revealed, and that sometimes justice really was possible. The sanctuary had been exposed for what it really was, not a place of spiritual refuge, but a carefully constructed trap designed to exploit the vulnerable and enrich the predator who controlled it. And Victor Kress, the man who had destroyed so many families in pursuit of his own gratification, was finally facing the reckoning he'd spent years avoiding. It was, I thought, exactly the kind of revelation that Pastor Kress had always preached about. The moment when truth conquers deception, when justice prevails over corruption, when the powerful are finally held accountable for their actions. The only difference was that this time, God's judgment had come through security cameras, financial records, and the courage of people who refused to be victims any longer.